I wrote 200 films before sound came in.
Hello all, and welcome to Women Behind the Camera Class 12, Complicated Women. In this class we will be discussing the female filmmakers whose filmic contributions and legacies are a bit more dark, questionable, and complicated than those whom we've studied so far, so stick around for some complicated discussion on complicated women. Your attendance assignment, by the way, will be as follows. So first I just wanted to point out that I had a lot of the same question recurring about the Final Dream Team project. Couple clarifications. Number one, no, this is not a research project. The information that we covered in this class so far and throughout the end of the semester is all that you really need to know. If you want to do your own research in addition to that, you're welcome to, but that's not necessary. And the second question that a lot of you had was whether this was supposed to be focused more on the women behind the camera themselves or the plot of the movie that they were working on. To which I would say you can, I would prefer that it be focused on the women, but you are welcome to tell me anything that you want about the plot of the movie that they are working on or the content or whatever, so long as it is relevant to their skills. Like, for example, my own, the one I chose would be, I would have Millicent Patrick, Wendy Froud, and Callie Corey collaborate with on a monster movie, with Millicent Patrick doing the suits, Wendy Froud doing the puppet creatures, very few humans in this film, because who cares about them, and Callie Corey, the writer of Thelma and Louise, making a feminist story for a monster girl to enact. And then if I went to, go on and tell you about, the specific aspects that I see in Callie Corey's work and how that would apply to my film, etc., blah, blah. So, your attendance assignment, long story short, is to email me briefly with just a one-sentence description of what movie you imagine the women that you have chosen for your project will be making, or admit that you haven't thought about it. Alright, go and pause the video and do that right now. Okay, you did it? Good. Before we get started, however, I first wanted to comment on your hidden assignments from last week, which again were really excellent, and I was again very impressed with the work of everyone in the class who posted. Kudos to you all, and keep up the good work. So there were a lot of discussion points, of course, revolving around the toxic working environment in the Walt Disney Studios story department in the 1930s, with a lot of people noting the cognitive dissonance that they experienced upon learning that Walt Disney, whom we all imagine as this perfect Mr. Rogers-like figure of warmth and universal love, was in reality a flawed human being who not only allowed a sexist working environment to exist under his watch at his company, but who also contributed to it in unfortunate ways. This brings me to an interesting famous quote by Walt Disney himself, in which he said, "I do things that Walt Disney wouldn't do. Walt Disney doesn't smoke. I smoke. Walt Disney doesn't drink. I drink." And that's the end of the quote. This quote illustrates the extent to which Disney was aware that he had become a brand. He had marketed his company, which bore his name, on the concept of wholesomeness, and that, in many ways, was the self-imposed character that he became expected to play, to the point at which the real Walt Disney, the flawed human being, has been practically erased from history in favor of this, shall we say, more Disneyfied version of the man. It's an interesting piece of historiography, I find, to see what narratives we have inherited. Narratives that tend to erase the contributions of women, as we've seen, to elevate the contributions of men, and to candy coat the negative aspects of any given successful man's personal history. Walt Disney is far from the only such male figure who falls into this category. Obviously, many of the long glorified founding fathers of this nation were slave-owning white elitists. Christopher Columbus was a genocidal monster. Thomas Edison was a virulent copyright troll and intellectual property pirate who stole credit for countless other people's inventions, etc., etc., etc. And yet, the stories that we hear about all these men in grade school tend to be simply glorifying accounts of how great and heroic and brave and important and intelligent and, wonderful they were, and not about how complex and problematic and even villainous they may have been in their times. This, of course, is part of how systems of power tend to self-perpetuate. If human beings already have a natural inclination towards believing whatever they heard first more strongly than whatever they heard later, and we have a culture that perpetuates the teaching of young children about these great men without the full context of who they were, and of course also perpetuates the near complete omission and erasure of the contributions of women, this is a significant part of how we got where we are today, with a culture that widely assumes and perpetuates the false narrative that great white men did everything of significance that was ever done by human beings in all of our species' history. But I want you all to be wary of something, a logical fallacy and a huge caveat that you should all look out for and be aware of in this class and in general throughout your lives. The tendency in human nature to want to do a complete 180 and to engage in black and white thinking and to assume that if, say, a figure like Walt Disney wasn't always the cartoonishly perfect and wholesome being whom we had all imagined him to be, then therefore he must have been the opposite of that something, he must have been something truly dreadful, which I feel it's very important to state he categorically was not. I even hesitate, to be perfectly honest with you, to draw the historiographical parallel that lumps Disney in the same category as the founding fathers, Columbus and Thomas Edison, as I feel like, this does a great injustice to Walt Disney, and there are millions of degrees of separation between the faults in Walt Disney and the faults of these men. It goes without saying, for example, that Walt Disney never owned a person, Walt Disney never killed a person, Walt Disney never sicked thugs on workers of rival movie studios or stole patents from poor scientists at the dawn of the 1900s, etc., etc. In short, Walt Disney was a flawed person, yes, and a product of his time, aren't we all? And while I don't mean to make excuses for him, it's very important once the bubble of our wrong belief in his imagined perfection is burst, not to replace it with yet another bubble of wrong belief in his imagined monstrosity, as this is not the case either. To that end, I'd like to dispel some misinformation and rumor that cropped up among the comments in last week's hidden assignment, specifically comments alleging that Walt Disney was a racist or even that he was pro-Nazi, neither of which are credible claims at all due to a lack of verifiable evidence in support of them and some very strong evidence to the contrary. First off, Walt Disney deliberately opened Disneyland as a racially integrated theme park in a liberal state at a time when segregation was the law of the land in much of the country. It would have been easy not to have done that, unfortunately, at the time, and Disney deserves credit for keeping his parks inclusive at its foundation. That in and of itself, I think, shows you a positive priority of this person. Walt Disney himself is also known to have traveled to South America on a campaign to discourage Nazi sentiment rising in Latin American countries, and while the Disney cartoon Der Fuhrer's Face, as brought up in the discussion board comments, yes, does indeed include depictions of Donald Duck as a Nazi. It is in fact an example of anti-Nazi propaganda meant to lampoon the Nazis and depict them as villains, not to glorify them, obviously, as the cartoon came out in 1943 while we were actively fighting the Nazis in World War II. So context is very important there. The one credible claim about any potential bigotry on Walt Disney's part is the claim, surprisingly not brought up by anyone in the discussion board comments, which I thought was interesting, that he was an anti-Semite, which is unfortunately somewhat corroborated by the fact that Walt Disney once did sign a petition circulated around Hollywood in the Cold War decrying communists, crackpots, and Jews, an actual quote from the actual petition, as I recall reading it. And is known to have harbored ill sentiment against Jewish film industry mogul Charles Mintz, whom Disney felt cheated him out of his original cartoon creation, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the precursor to Mickey Mouse. That said, Walt Disney is also known to have later developed a great love and respect for the Jewish composer-lyricist duo Richard and Robert Sherman, aka the Sherman Brothers, and to have stood up for them on several occasions and even fired Disney employees, including one bigoted lawyer who disparaged them for being Jewish. So long story short, I don't believe there is sufficient evidence to suggest that Walt Disney as an individual was any more sexist, racist, or anti-Semitic than the average liberal-leaning person of his time, especially towards the end of his career. He was certainly not a Nazi, and although certain films that came out of the Disney studio in his time do indeed contain unfortunate racial depictions, these were so ingrained and common in the widespread popular culture of the times, even long before Disney emerged on the scene, that the Disney studio was far from alone in committing these casually racist depictions, and certainly did not invent or originate them. Not that this excuses their existence, just that they came out of a context and a culture much more overtly problematic, though perhaps disturbingly similar to what we continue to see to this day. When it comes to the specific experience of Bianca Majoli, one student pointed out in our post-class Zoom meeting the very salient reality that at the time that the traumatic event described in the book took place, when Walt Disney tore up Bianca's sketch in front of all the men of the writer's room and the ensuing pandemonium. At that time, the studio was in dire financial straits, a fact which Disney was keeping secret from his employees, and was therefore operating under a great deal of suppressed internal stress. In truth, the whole thing looks to me very much like an extreme stress reaction combined with a weak, not yet fully established sense of authority on Disney's part that had basically allowed a toxic environment to take seed and grow out of control. As one student wrote, I feel like it speaks to how allowing small, inappropriate behaviors initially can spiral out of control. I feel like the men in that department became desensitized to their own crudeness. That's the end of that quote. A statement with which I strongly agree, as I doubt Disney ever meant it to escalate to the point of breaking down Bianca Majoli's door to continue to harass her. I actually interpret his later statement, Disney's quote, that this is why we can't use women, they can't take a little criticism, as a defensive mechanism. I feel like there is no way that Walt Disney didn't know that the men's behavior in that incident was extremely wrong and was the problem, not Bianca Majoli's reaction to it. I think any human being could easily tell that. And that it was also very much his own fault for not only allowing this environment to exist in the first place by, being new at the idea of leadership and not really knowing how to put his foot down and control these other men, but, for also ripping up her drawing and instigating this brouhaha. I suspect that Disney clearly, must have felt very guilty for being the one responsible for escalating the situation, losing his cool, ripping up her artwork in a moment of extreme stress, weakness, and accidentally sending his rowdy male employees the message that now was the time to attack like a pack of wolves. Obviously, this was all very wrong, and Disney should have owned his responsibility for it, apologized to Bianca, made his male employees apologize, maybe fired anyone who refused to, and established a working environment that did not terrorize female employees. While he didn't do these things, as far as our records tell us, Walt Disney, again, nevertheless remains the single male animation studio head who did the best by women, both in terms of employing them in the highest numbers and in terms of promoting them to higher and higher positions. The more women that Disney hired, the less he seemed to hesitate to hire more, which to me echoes his experience with the Sherman Brothers, and that it appears that Walt Disney may have begun his career with the backward assumptions of his day, but was able to learn from his mistakes and to let go of many of the flaws that he had in his earlier career, especially in terms of sexism and anti-Semitism, and evolve into a much better person by the later years of his career. If we are to create an accurate portrait of Walt Disney, or anyone for that matter, as a person, these factors must be considered as well. His flaws as well as his triumphs over them, his failings as well as his growth. It is with this level of nuanced, complicated understanding that I would like to approach the women on our screening list for tonight, with the understanding that, like Walt Disney and Christopher Columbus, there will be varying degrees of complicated history here, and not all the complicated women that we will be discussing are inherently equal or complicated for the same reasons. Some are merely guilty of perpetuating sexist stereotypes in their films. Some are literal Nazis making Nazi propaganda. So being aware of that and understanding our purposes here, let's start off our discussion, as we usually do, with complicated women at the dawn of film history in the early silent era. As Betty Davis says in her gown designed by Edith Head in All About Eve,
"Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night."
So, starting in the early silent era before the soft purge, the very first complicated woman I want to bring to your attention tonight is a familiar face, costume designer Claire West, whom we studied briefly a few weeks ago in our lesson on costumers, hairdressers, and makeup artists. In addition to the beautiful, relatively non-controversial costumes she designed for a wide variety of Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille productions, it should be noted that she also designed a set of costumes for a film that has had extremely sinister real-world implications. This, sadly, from Wikipedia. West went straight into Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, 1915, with her designs for more cinematic Ku Klux Klan costumes inspiring the current dress of the KKK. That's the end of the quote, emphasis mine. Historic KKK costumes prior to the film The Birth of a Nation looked, in a word, stupid. Often derpy, awkward, and obviously handmade by men in the 1800s with no sewing skills, it made logical sense from a cinematic standpoint to dress the KKK in the film more dramatically, as of course the film is very much telling a white supremacist version of history and takes the KKK as the heroes of its story. Now, on the one hand, Claire West was, of course, just a costume designer making costumes for a fictional film. She would have had no way of knowing that this film was to inspire a resurgence of the then-defunct Ku Klux Klan that would last on to the present day and be responsible, that is, for untold numbers of murders, rapes, and acts of domestic violence, terrorism, and other forms of, terrible racist hate crimes, all while wearing costumes inspired by her most iconic contribution to this film. On the other hand, the film was obviously heinously racist and recognized as such by a significant portion of the American population even in its time, and Claire West absolutely could have chosen not to work on this project. Would the KKK not have had a renaissance in the mid-1910s that has lasted on to this day had someone less competent than Claire West designed their costumes in this film? Would white supremacists have eschewed a century plus of racist violence had the costumes looked as dumb as they did in the historic Reconstruction era? We may never know, but it is a fascinating fact and indeed a bizarre reality that this hauntingly iconic evil costume, and of course perhaps a part of its evil legacy, belongs to female costume designer and nearly erased woman behind the camera, Claire West. At this point, you may be feeling kind of weird, right? Kind of uncomfortable. You may be wondering why this is relevant or important. Why are you telling us all this, Professor Saporin? You may well be asking. Well, ultimately, the thesis of this week's class lecture is this. Up to this point, we have been celebrating the contributions of women behind the camera in a long, unending string of positivity and constructive good. But I don't want to leave you with the false impression that just because a film was made in some way by a woman, that therefore the film must be inherently good or progressive or pro-social or positive for the human species and doing good for the world. Indeed, this is far from the case, as we will be seeing throughout tonight's lecture, as an important part of realizing the equality between the genders can be summarized for better or for worse in these terms. Realizing true gender equality means understanding that women have the capacity to be just as wrong or as evil as men. Inasmuch as it is possible for men to make art that is foul, immoral, or bad for whatever reason, inasmuch as it is possible for male people to hold wrong ideas and have these ideas come out in their art, so too is this possible for women. So too is this possible for female people, because female people are human beings and thus equally capable of evil, injustice, and wrong. This is a dark lesson to have to learn, but it is ultimately a very important one. We cannot operate under the false assumption that women are inherently, universally, always going to be more socially progressive than men, nor do I want to leave you with the false belief that all female filmmakers are inherently blameless victims of male oppression. Indeed, as we will see, some of them participated on the inflicting end of oppression themselves. On the whole, it may be true that the vast majority of female filmmakers create much more socially progressive and feministic content than the vast majority of male filmmakers. This remains true and should not be forgotten, and in no way do I mean to override that lesson with this one. But the reality is that there will always be outlying individuals in every category. There will be men who make extremely progressive films, and women who are literal Nazis. In short, don't let someone's gender fool or blind you into failing to look deeper or to question the impact of their contributions, both for better and for worse. To that end, let's pause here for a moment to take a look at a clip from one of my all-time favorite silent films, 1927's Metropolis, a German expressionist silent film which I feel needs no introduction. So without further ado, let's watch Metropolis. Metropolis is one of the most beautiful films ever made, with a fabulous, complex science fiction plot that contains what do appear to be the first robot and the first fully fledged mad scientist archetype, as we currently recognize these things, in all of film history. Thea von Harbo, the screenwriter of Metropolis, is absolutely brilliant, and I deeply admire her work. I've even read an English translation of her original German novelization of the film, which is at least as beautiful as the film itself. It's a fabulously written book. Overall, both the film Metropolis and the novelization contain a very progressive message in favor of the importance of labor unions and collective bargaining held between union organizers and business owners so as to prevent, horrendously unsafe, unfair, and exploitative conditions and factory work and other kinds of blue-collar labor. Sounds good, right? Sounds like, one for the list of female filmmakers preaching the word of Lois Weber and Bernie Sanders in the silent era, doesn't it? And I agree, to a large extent it absolutely does seem like that, except Thea von Harbou, a German woman known for her work writing very pro-nationalist films, was, unfortunately, can you guess where this is going, a loyal part of the Nazi regime. To be fair, this technically happened after the film Metropolis came out, and Harbou would later claim that her loyalty to the Nazi Party was all just an act to help Indian immigrants into Germany, like her husband. A fascinating piece of complex history for you right there, illustrating the complexity of this complicated woman. But considering the level of her involvement and the already nationalistic quality of her work even prior to when the Nazis came to power, combined with the accounts that I've read of her ex-husband, director Fritz Lang, backing away from her more and more when her Nazi support was first coming out, I feel it is at least accurate to state that she was complicit in the Nazi regime, loyal to their rule, and cooperative with their demands of her. In short, a complicated woman. Keeping in mind the old adage that you have to separate the artist from the work, I think it's fair to continue to enjoy Metropolis and, even to celebrate it as a significant filmic contribution written by a woman, even if that woman would later become a part of the Nazi regime. For a more sympathetic, if no less complicated story about female German filmmakers making silent films under Nazi rule, we must turn back fascinatingly to Lotte Reiniger, the Jewish female animator who pioneered silhouette animation in Germany before fleeing the Holocaust with her husband, escaping to England and various other parts of Europe as their travel visas would allow. As Jews, they had great difficulty obtaining refugee status from the Holocaust, even in the Allied countries, which were then openly anti-Semitic, including, unfortunately, the United States itself. And they had to hop from country to country, knowing that their Jewishness and their status as progressive, liberal intellectuals would put them in mortal danger if they ever returned to Germany. But, fascinatingly, after receiving a telegram from Lotte Reiniger's mother to the effect that she was very ill, starving, and in constant mortal danger from the repeated bombings by the Allied forces in Berlin, the couple bravely risked capture so as to return and care for Lotte Reiniger's mother, at which point, perhaps most strangely of all, Reiniger was approached by the Nazi government and asked to make propaganda films for Germany in her famed silhouette animation style. Hating the Nazi regime and finding herself in mortal danger being Jewish, politically progressive, and known to the Nazis, Reiniger had no choice and made these films for the Nazis while fearing for her life. It is unknown, as far as I am aware, whether the Nazis knew that Lotte Reiniger was Jewish and chose to look the other way because they wanted her to make propaganda films for them, or if they had genuinely lost this information through some kind of a clerical error. To my knowledge, even Lotte Reiniger herself never found out the answer to this question, as asking would have obviously outed her as Jewish and could have potentially cost her her life. Either way, film scholars note that her work for the Nazis is visibly less fluidly animated, beautiful, or otherwise enthusiastic than the work that she created for herself, which really should not be surprising considering that her heart would clearly not have been in it. She would have been creating the work under the stress of mortal fear and, suppressed hatred for the regime that she was making it for. Ironically, it was these propaganda films that enabled Reiniger to obtain the food stamps necessary to nurse her mother back to health and preserve and sustain the survival of this Jewish family. Complex and fascinating. I regret that I was unable to find any of her work online that was made for the Nazis. I can find all of her fairy tale stuff. I've seen it before. I was just unable to find any videos of it. The one that I saw that I vividly remember was an artillery safety training film meant for Nazi soldiers, in which she had silhouette, animated figures like loading cannons and like explaining the safety measures of, how to use heavy artillery. Unfortunately, I don't have footage of that, but that's what it was. And I'm sure that there were others. Anyway, before we leave the Nazi regime behind, however, we must, of course, discuss the work of Leni Riefenstahl, perhaps the most problematic and personally complicit woman behind the camera on our list tonight, and the subject of your reading for this week. Leni Riefenstahl is one of the earliest and perhaps the single most famous German female film directors, for better or for worse, and probably for worse, who, of course, was a staunch supporter of the Nazi regime. Her work is naturally complicated. I'll be the first to admit that she gets off some really amazing shots. She has a great cinematic eye and a keen sense of visual impact. But she is a Nazi, like a really bad one, to the point where she was literally friends with Adolf Hitler. And she uses her artistic skills towards a truly heinous end. Indeed, in a world without television or internet, many film scholars believe that her propaganda films were instrumental in spreading Nazi sympathy over Germany in the 1930s, and thus partially responsible for the entire legacy of the Nazi Party itself, Holocaust and all. Unlike Thea von Harbo and Lotte Reiniger, Leni Riefenstahl was a Nazi at the time of creating her most famous work, which she also created willingly for the Nazis, not under the threat of her life, the film Triumph of the Will from 1935, a piece of Nazi propaganda which, according to Wikipedia, is widely considered one of the most effective and technically innovative propaganda films ever made. That's the end of that quote. Even though, as Roger Ebert points out in your reading for this week, it probably wouldn't be able to convince anybody who wasn't already a Nazi or leaning that way into becoming one just from watching the film. But there are definitely eerie elements to it, and though it's not gory or sexually explicit or really offensive by any normal measure, I feel I should give you guys a bit of a trigger warning nonetheless. There is going to be a lot of rousing, uplifting, positive-sounding music played alongside images of a literal Nazi rally in a moment. And as a Jewish person myself, I experience a great amount of cognitive dissonance, confusion, and discomfort from my instinctive enjoyment of the music and the serene visuals, knowing full well what this film is and where it is going, and what it had a hand in doing to human history. If this is too painful for you, feel free to skip ahead just this once. Otherwise, for better or for worse, let's take a look at some clips from 1935's Triumph of the Will right now. Wikipedia. Shortly before she died, Riefenstahl voiced her final words on the subject of her connection to Adolf Hitler in a BBC interview. "I was one of millions who thought Hitler had all the answers. We saw only the good things. We didn't know the bad things were to come." And that's the end of the quote. I personally do not buy Riefenstahl's excuses, though I agree with her assessment that she had chosen to only see the good things and allowed herself to become deeply and dangerously entangled in a toxic political fantasy in a way that we are unfortunately seeing repeat itself in our current political situation right here in America today. It remains, I think, another powerful cautionary tale, like that of The Birth of a Nation, where we can see the power and impact of propaganda that glorifies a certain group or a certain person in a heroic, majestic, even godlike way, when this person or this group, be it the Nazis or the KKK, are actually just a bunch of racist murderers and thugs using the platform of cinema to spread their message far and wide in a way that will end up costing countless thousands of people their lives, maybe millions of people, and becoming a foul and indelible stain upon human history. These films, I feel, make a solid argument in favor of the need for imposing legal limitations on the use of propaganda in mass media, whether it be for film, television, internet streaming, news shows, or anything else, as these platforms have the capacity to reach millions of people, and when you reach millions of people with a message of nationalism and racist violence, you create a situation in which fascism thrives, democracy is strangled, and no one is safe. I know that there are those who would argue that this is censorship, oh no, censorship, and that censorship is always wrong. But I'd like to challenge that notion with the point that nothing is ever absolutely right or absolutely wrong. Context is everything. And when we're talking about films like Triumph of the Will and The Birth of a Nation, it gets really hard to make the argument that these films were ever just neutral pieces of art with no potential for negative impact, and that censoring them in their times wouldn't have been a net positive. But that said, the first part of your hidden assignment for tonight is a real thought-provoker. The question being that, if you were somehow in charge of national theatrical film releases in Germany in 1935, would you, personally, choose to let the film Triumph of the Will play in theaters across Germany because it is an art piece and you believe that censorship is always wrong? Or would you censor it and prevent it from being spread far and wide, feeling that its impact could greatly and gravely outweigh any concerns of artistic freedom, that is, in terms of real human cost? Or is there some third option, some other idea that perhaps occurs to you that might be valuable to consider? Think about it and email me with what you would decide to do in this imaginary scenario by no later than 11:30 p.m. tonight. Good luck. So, perhaps much to your collective relief, that will be all for our discussion on deeply unpleasant political things like the Nazis and the KKK for this class on Complicated Women. Congratulations! Wipe that sweat from your brow and breathe a sigh of relief. Only a few Nazi filmmakers were women, one did it unwillingly, and a woman basically designed the costumes of the modern KKK. That's the takeaway because, maybe women are complicated human beings and not a monolith, kind of like men, because women are human. They're capable of being wrong and doing wrong things in a wide variety of ways and for a wide variety of reasons. Anyway, this brings us to a discussion of the remaining complicated women behind the camera whom we have on our list for tonight, all of whom are complicated more in the realm of the portrayal of women within their films than for any truly horrifying reason that deals with war crimes or domestic terrorism or murder or anything remotely like that. If you're interested in learning more about the portrayal of women throughout American film history, I recommend taking Blondes and Bombshells, another class that I teach and might be teaching again next year if the scheduling happens to work out, so look out for that. So to that end, Think of these women more along the lines of Walt Disney, to use our earlier metaphor, than of Christopher Columbus. Complicated and maybe deeply problematic in some ways, but not monstrous genocidal maniacs or anything remotely of that nature. First off, we have Susanna Grant, the writer of the film Erin Brockovich from the year 2000. While hailed as a feministic film in its time, and to a certain extent even today, Erin Brockovich is more accurately described as an example of mixed message, or as I prefer to call it, compromised feminism. Compromised feminism. Compromised feminism is a sort of blending of feminism and sexism, a sort of muddying of the message that Hollywood has tended to lean on in portrayals of female characters in the modern era, and especially prominent in the early 2000s. This often takes the form of an attempt to appeal to male audiences by disproportionately sexualizing female characters and not sexualizing male characters in equal measure, while simultaneously portraying these female characters as having heroic agency, a move meant to appeal to female audiences and also deflect from accusations of sexism, muddying the waters and making it harder to call out the filmmakers for placing the sexual burden exclusively on women's shoulders and perpetuating all the unhealthy body image issues and other double standards that this entails. For a glimpse into these issues, let's take a look at 2000's Erin Brockovich right now.
You have no actual training.
I have kids. Learned a lot right there. Yeah, and I'm great with people. When I was first out of high school, I got married and had a kid too young. I'm extremely fast learner. You got a really nice office.
Look.
You want my number?
I do.
How about this for number 6? That's how old my daughter is. 8 is the age of my son. 2 is how many times I've been divorced. 16 is the number of dollars I have in my bank account.
I'm so glad we got that out of the way, because I didn't find you attractive either.
Then we're even. I'm smart, I'm hardworking, and I'll do anything, and I'm not leaving here without a job. Don't make me beg.
In a law firm, you may want to rethink your wardrobe a little.
Well, as long as I have one ass instead of 2, I'll wear what I like, if that's all right with you. You might want to rethink those ties. Why are there medical records and blood samples in real estate files? Would you mind if I investigate this a little further?
What makes you think you can just walk in there and find what we need?
They're called boobs, Ed. Can I just...
Yeah, just... Hexavalent chromium can be very harmful.
So, it kills people.
Oh, yeah.
You're a lawyer? Hell no. I hate lawyers. I just work for them.
We're going to have to spend a little time filling in the holes in your research.
Don't talk to me like I'm an idiot, okay?
I think we got off on the wrong foot here.
That's all you got, lady. 2 wrong feet and ugly shoes.
You gotta find a different job or a different guy.
For the first time in my life, I got people respecting me. Please, don't ask me to give it up.
You're emotional, you're erratic, you make this personal, and it isn't.
That is my work, my sweat, my time away from my kids. If that's not personal, I don't know what is.
We're gonna get them, Erin, aren't we?
They're all signed, every single one.
How did you do this?
Seeing as how I have no brains or legal expertise, I just went out there and performed 634 sexual favors. I'm really quite tired.
$20 million is more money than these people have ever dreamed of.
These people don't dream about being rich. They dream about being able to watch their kids swim in a pool without worrying that they'll have to have a hysterectomy at the age of 20. By the way, we had that water brought in special for you folks.
Last semester, I had a student argue that the moment when Erin Brockovich chooses to objectify herself and use her body to seduce the male clerk to get the records that she needs, that this was an example of a feministic filmic portrayal, which of course it is not, basing her argument on the misunderstanding that self-objectification is a form of feminism, which, again, it is not. We encountered this a little bit in our brief glimpse at the work of Tina Fey, perhaps another complicated woman for different reasons involving the racial casting of certain characters that we won't get into too far here. But back in our lesson on female producers, specifically in the clip of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, where post-feminism is lampooned for mistaking itself as actual third, fourth wave feminism. That's right, I said post-feminism. Post-feminism, in a nutshell, is a cultural movement that began circa the early 2000s that put forth the idea that gender equality had somehow already been achieved and that therefore there was no longer any need for feminism. It also included the idea that traditional feminists were sensorial extremists who needed to be beaten down, and that women have a ticking biological clock and need to get married and have kids ASAP, and that women should spend huge amounts of time and money on self-care, expensive products and clothes, so as to look pretty for themselves, among other things. This leads me to a discussion on the logical fallacy that everything a woman chooses to do with her body is inherently a form of feminism. This is a nice thought, but the problem with this line of thinking is, of course, that it ignores the capacity for women to be sexist. Surprise! Women are humans and just as capable of being sexist. It also ignores the capacity of a self-interested patriarchal culture to influence women, even on an unconscious level, into making choices that benefit men more than they benefit women themselves. For instance, dressing and revealing clothing, self-objectification in real life or on social media, speaking judgmentally of other women's appearances.
That's all you got, lady. 2 wrong feet and ugly shoes.
Etc. While it's certainly possible for a woman to dress in revealing clothing for her own happiness and comfort, absolutely, it is, to say the least, an unsafe assumption that every woman who does so is inherently being a feminist, and it is actually quite problematic that we have a culture that defines female attractiveness in terms of unrealistic and often unattainable standards of beauty, often defined and, thought up by men, that put a tremendous amount of pressure on women to endure all manner of discomfort so as to conform to them. As such, whether a woman is trying to achieve these standards of beauty for herself or not, there is an inherently patriarchal thumb on the scale influencing her perceptions on what is desirable, what is attractive, and what is good for her. In the case of Erin Brockovich specifically, we must remember that this is a Hollywood film directed by a man and spearheaded by a largely male executive-led studio, despite being written by a woman. Erin Brockovich is dressed revealingly because objectifying women sells in Hollywood. Don't let the film's argument about women wearing whatever they want fool you. This is very much the real reason why this is happening in this film, and male executives generally seem to fear objectifying men in equal measure, so we have an inherent filmic culture with far more female sexualization than male, despite the fact that history reveals a tendency of male sexualization to sell in equal measure, as those who took my Blondes and Bombshells class last semester will well know. Erin Brockovich also engages in the then popular activity of attempting to trigger the feminists by making stupid jokes about how many sexual favors in the actual final film, the line is blowjobs, the main character allegedly performed to get the needed documents. Which she did, as it turns out, indeed obtain by using herself, in a much milder sense, as a sexual object. The scene in this film is played as a weirdly heroic moment of embarrassing the more proper female lawyer with the idea of Brockovich's alleged sexual exploits, and reads again as a classic moment of problematic early 2000s culture that likes to rub compromised feminism in the faces of real feminists as a way to get a rise out of them, under the wrong belief that this is somehow a course of action that empowers women. So the takeaway here, as with the rest of the women on the list for tonight, is that women can be sexist too. Just because a film was written or directed or edited or otherwise made by a woman behind the camera in some way does not mean that this film is therefore 100% feministic or somehow incapable of being sexist or containing any sexist elements. Sometimes women, especially older women who grew up in and after the 1950s, the nadir of women's position in American social culture, sometimes women can be just as sexist as some men as a result of a sexist upbringing at a sexist time in history. Interestingly, I've observed that older European women tend to be even more sexist than older American women who grew up in this time period, especially in places like England and France, where sexism still runs rampant in much more overt ways than the relatively quieter forms commonly seen in current American culture. It's also important to keep in mind that filmmaking is, again, an inherently collaborative effort. Meaning that female creators working in collaboration with large numbers of men may have their intended messages compromised by the influence of their male collaborators. With these thoughts in mind, let's move our discussion now to two films from 2003 and 2004, respectively, Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2. Both co-written by Uma Thurman, who also stars as the film's lead, and both edited by Sally Menke, whose name, again, I am not sure I am pronouncing correctly, further illustrating the ways in which people, and especially women behind the camera, who are neither directors nor actors, are commonly ignored by mainstream filmic journalism and public discourse. Let's start by taking a look at Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2 right now.
Not too long ago, I was quite the professional. My friends and I, we were the creme de la creme in an exclusive industry. And we all worked for this man, Bill. Then one day, I decided to leave, settle down, and start a new life. But when I tried to get out, they did me in.
Don't you ever wake up.
I guess they should have tried a little harder.
So I suppose it's a little late for an apology, huh?
You suppose correctly. Now it's kill or be killed.
You have every right to want to get even.
Get even? Even, Stephen?
I would have to kill you. That'd be about square.
And I choose kill.
Mommy, I'm home.
Hey, baby. How was school?
One ticket to Tokyo, please. One way.
That woman deserves her revenge. And we deserve to die.
No kidding, I heard it was kind of hard.
Silly Caucasian girl likes to play with samurai swords.
Yeah. Any more subordinates for me to kill?
Hi.
You didn't think it was going to be that easy, did you? For a second there?
Yeah, I kind of did.
Silly rabbit.
Hard part's over. The incident that happened at the Two Pines wedding chapel that put this whole gory story into motion has since become legend.
That woman deserves her revenge. And we deserve to die.
I've killed a hell of a lot of people to get to this point, and I am gonna kill Bill.
Before this tale of bloody revenge reaches its climax, there's a few unanswered questions. If Pai Mei doesn't kill you, he will make you stronger. Being shot you in the head. There are consequences to breaking the heart of a killer.
Pretty cool, huh?
She's coming to kill you. She cut her way through 88 bodyguards. No, there wasn't really 88 of them. They just called themselves the Crazy 88. How come? I don't know. I guess they thought it sounded cool.
Hi, Mommy.
So it all suddenly seems so clear.
I was a killer who killed for you. I had to choose. I chose her. She must suffer to her last breath. You and I have unfinished business.
Baby, you ain't kidding. I'm sorry. I overreacted.
You overreacted?
Now, again, the films of the Kill Bill series, though edited and co-written by women, are nonetheless examples of compromised feminism in their portrayals of the female characters. The female characters in these films are all high-agency roles. They take action for themselves, they have badass fights with cool cinematography, and are certainly glorified as powerful action heroes. No one is arguing against that. That said, almost every single one of them falls easily into at least one of a wide selection of categories of male sexual kinks and fantasies. The sexy nurse, the underage Japanese schoolgirl, the pristine doll-like Japanese woman, the latter two with an awkward racial fetish thrown in there, and finally, and perhaps most unfortunately, the rape victim. Perhaps the single most overused and hackneyed stereotype trope when it comes to the portrayal of female characters in post-soft purge filmic history. While I admire the action in the cool fight sequences, whose compelling nature I think is largely attributable to Sally Manx editing, I must admit that the first Kill Bill film lost me almost immediately when it decided to portray its lead, the classic strong female protagonist, as a catatonic rape victim who has endured years' worth of serial rape at the hands of a hospital orderly and his accomplices. This turned me off from the film so much I can't even, so to speak, as it was not only completely unnecessary to the plot, yet another notch on the by now interminably long list of female main characters who are unnecessarily turned into rape victims, as if women can only be main characters if they've been raped. This is a very weird theme that we'll be seeing again later on, so stay tuned. And as it immediately derailed my own motivations as a female identifying person, as to me personally, the loss of an unborn baby whom I never met pales in comparison, obviously, to the idea of being raped for 4 years, and the dismissal of the rapist character with a quick and easy defeat felt weirdly out of touch with my own priorities as a female person. I was ready to see the rapist character get tortured and punished for the rest of the film's runtime, not immediately shelved as if he didn't matter in favor of some other less important priority. I didn't care about the bride's stupid baby and her stupid revenge plot against a list of people whose only crime was failing to kill her, and only failing to kill her once, not raping her repeatedly for 4 years. In short, I was immediately alienated from the plot by this, I feel, rather thoughtless and inorganic choice that ignores huge amounts of human motivation and seriously significant aspects of female people's priorities and perspectives. Personally, I suspect that this move has Quentin Tarantino written all over it. I doubt that Uma Thurman thought of this particular plot point all by herself, though I'm sure she must have, contributed something to it, or at least okayed it. If she was the co-writer, I imagine that she must have collaborated in some way. And obviously, Sally Manx's job as the editor is merely to put the film together as written in as dynamic and interesting a way as possible. So I don't really think that we can necessarily place the lion's share of blame for these shortcomings onto either Uma Thurman or Sally Manx specifically. Nevertheless, they absolutely did contribute to this problematic film series containing multiple depictions of compromised feminism that make them, in my book, complicated women. Moving right along in time, next up we have 2006's The Devil Wears Prada, a film that might be the single most emblematic post-feminist narrative not currently being played on the Hallmark Channel. Though both the screenplay and the story it was based on were written by women, story by Lauren Weisberger and screenplay by Aileen Brosh McKenna, respectively, the film's conclusion is a bit of a post-feminist mess. What's so fascinating about The Devil Wears Prada to me is the fact that throughout most of the film's runtime, you're rooting for the main character, played by Anne Hathaway, to succeed in the world of high fashion, and at first, this is how the film positions you to feel. Then it kind of stops on a dime and, spoiler alert for this now 14-year-old film, decides out of nowhere towards the end that this is suddenly the wrong choice and tries to force the narrative into a story in which leaving her high-status job in the fashion industry and going back to her mediocre boyfriend is the right thing to do, even though this feels extremely inorganic to most viewers I have talked to, and myself included. For a glimpse at these issues, let's take a look at 2006's The Devil Wears Prada right now.
Miranda Priestley's the editor-in-chief of Runway.
So you don't read Runway?
No. Not to mention a legend.
And before today, you'd never heard of me?
No. You work a year for her, and you can get a job at any magazine you want.
You have no style or sense of fashion. No. That wasn't a question.
You got a job at a fashion magazine? What was it, a phone interview?
Who is that? Are we doing a before and after piece I don't know about?
In the world of high fashion.
There you are, Emily.
Actually, it's Andy. My name is Andy. A million girls would kill for this job.
Is there some reason that my coffee isn't here? Did she go to Rwanda for the beans or something?
Where so much is at stake.
I need 10 or 15 skirts.
The pie!
Hello? Where are my eggs? Lingerie.
She is vicious.
Andy Sachs is about to discover.
She hates me, Nigel. There's a way that you can help me.
Little Crisco and some fishing line, and we're in business.
It's not just about what you wear.
What do you think? Andy, you look so chic. You look so thin. Do I? Just one stomach flew away from my goal weight.
It's about who you are.
Nate.
I got it.
Let me talk to her. No, the thing with the phone. I'm leaving right now.
Do you know why I hired you? I see a great deal of myself in you.
The person whose calls you always take, that's the relationship you're in.
Let me know when your whole life goes up in smoke. When is it's time for a promotion?
People think that success just happens to you. It doesn't. You want this life? The decision's yours.
The Devil Wears Prada.
Once again, for those of you who run the risk of getting that question we went over on the final exam wrong, The Devil Wears Prada was made in 2006 and regressively pushes the post-feminist narrative of discouraging women from pursuing high-status careers in favor of romantic relationships, marriage, and children. Just as a reminder, however, Dance Girl Dance was released in 1940 and remains the only film I have ever seen in which a woman has a choice between a man and a career, and her right choice is portrayed as her career, not the man. Thank you, Dorothy Arzner. Anyway, again, don't get this wrong on the final, and realize that the larger culture was actually much more socially progressive in a lot of surprising ways prior to the 1950s than it has ever been since. Culture moves in waves. It isn't a monolith nor an exponential climb like technology. It's an up and down graph like the stock market. Stick it in your brains and don't forget it. Anyway, when it comes to The Devil Wears Prada, the film's message ends up feeling extremely incoherent overall, as we are positioned, as I said, at first to root for the female protagonist's rising star in the fashion industry, that is, at the beginning, and then out of nowhere the film sort of gaslights us and seems to deny the validity of what we had been positioned to think and feel all along. Very weird. At one point towards the end, we are confronted with the protagonist's angry boyfriend accusing her of being a bitch, which is weird because this did not happen in the film. At no point is she ever remotely describable as a bitch, to him or to anyone else for that matter, and a statement to which she, weirdly, laughingly agrees and apologizes to her accusing ex-boyfriend, quits her amazing career in the fashion industry, and it's implied settles down with him to live happily ever after. That's what I recall from the last time I saw the film, and my jaw is still on the floor about it. This is likely the result of a little phenomenon that I like to call multiple authorial input. I'm not entirely sure who, and I'm not entirely sure how or in what capacity, but it is at the very least clear to me, as someone who has worked in the film industry and seen things like this happen before, that there were multiple different people working on the foundational story of this film with multiple different ideas about how the narrative should pan out. While only Lauren Weisberger and Aileen Brosh McKenna are credited as story writer and screenwriter respectively, there was likely executive producer input and studio pressure and a variety of other factors involved in pulling the story simultaneously in two different directions. The feminist direction of celebrating a woman's climb to the top, which seems to govern the first 3/4 of the story, and the post-feminist direction of discouraging women from having careers and pressuring them to settle down and have babies, which seems to govern the rather confusing and abrupt left turn of an ending. But like we said, the thing about film is that it is an inherently collaborative process. Multiple people are involved in making it, and to a certain degree, all of them have an impact and all of them get to have their say, which sometimes results in a self-contradictory narrative like that of The Devil Wears Prada. I'm not sure whether Lauren Weisberger or Aileen Brosh McKenna are responsible for the film's weird left-turn ending, but either way, it's a complicated post-feminist narrative, making them, at least in my book, complicated women. Let's move on now to some films directed by complicated women, starting with 2008's Twilight, directed by Catherine Hardwicke. Twilight is a film with two female writers as well, Melissa Rosenberg and Stephenie Meyer, in addition to Hardwicke, and yet the film still contains its fair share of problematic depictions of gender, particularly in its rather passive, low-agency female main character, and the normalization and even romanticization of what amounts to stalker behavior on the part of the male main character. To illustrate this latter issue, let's take a brief look at the Twilight clip from a BuzzFeed video that I like to point to, entitled "If Women's Roles in Movies Were Played by Men." Let's take a look.
How'd you get in here?
The window.
Do you do that a lot?
Just the past couple months. I like watching you sleep. It's kind of fascinating to me.
So again, just because something was written and directed by women doesn't inherently mean that it's necessarily, therefore, progressive in terms of its depictions of gender. Keep in mind, again, that there were, and sadly still are, female Nazis. Women are totally capable of being wrong about things, and one of the pantheon of things to be wrong about in this universe is the progressive depiction of gender. Women can do that badly too, even though they're women. It's possible, and Twilight is a good example of it, so let's take a look at 2008's Twilight right now.
How did you know where I was?
I didn't.
All right.
What? No. Don't leave.
Did you follow me?
I feel very protective of you. I wanted to kill you. I've never wanted a human's blood so much in my life.
I trust you.
Don't.
How did you get in here?
The window?
Do you do that a lot?
Well, just the past couple of months. I like watching you sleep.
It might be worth noting, too, that Catherine Hardwicke was born in 1955, Melissa Rosenberg in 1962, and Stephanie Meyer in 1973. None of these women grew up in particularly gender-progressive decades, especially not by today's standards, and for what progress was being made in the later, 60s and 70s in terms of second-wave feminism, it's important to note that this progress was being simultaneously offset by an ongoing cultural backlash demonizing the women's liberation movement, successfully putting an end to the Equal Rights Amendment. It's true, that amendment was never passed thanks to the anti-feminist backlash of the 1970s. Women still to this day do not technically have equal rights by law in the United States, not so fun fact. And of course, this backlash also introduced the exploitative hypersexualization of women in American and world filmic culture in the 1960s, to say nothing of the regressive bombardment of sexist messages inflicted on the populace throughout the 1950s. So maybe the culture surrounding these women during their early years bears some of the burden of explaining the failings that their filmic depictions of gender may have been prone to, despite being women themselves. You can raise women to be sexist. That said, it should also be noted that, in full fairness, Catherine Hardwicke's work on Twilight, problematic and flawed though it may have been, was nonetheless a very rare and impressive example of an extremely successful film directed by a woman in the post-feminist early 2000s. Twilight grossed over $69 million on its opening weekend alone, and went on to make over $400 million worldwide. For a film whose budget was the low by Hollywood standards figure of only $37 million, this was an insane runaway success. It was also, I should note, an example of a woman being handed a low-budget project that she was, not expected to succeed with, a film that was not expected to do good business. As we've discussed before, women are much less likely to be hired to direct high-budget, prestigious films, the kinds of films that are likely to make the most money, as male executives in the film world tend to reserve these types of high-status roles as exclusively male spaces. According to the 2018 Vanity Fair article, 10 years after Twilight, Catherine Hardwicke knows she deserved more, and here is the quote from that article. An executive once told Hardwicke that her film might be interesting at most to about 400 girls in Salt Lake City. And that's the end of the quote. Obviously, the film did much better business than that, and as this same article notes, seems to have actually started the YA, or young adult, novel film craze, as well as launching the careers of actors Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson. Here's another relevant quote from this same article that I feel should be brought up for your consideration, discussing Catherine Hardwicke right after the success of 2008's Twilight. Here's the quote. The director wasn't initially worried about what would come next for her. After all, she had just turned around an enormous blockbuster on a relatively tight budget, courting a slew of devoted new fans in the process. Offers should have been pouring in. But Hardwicke found that she couldn't even get in the room for certain gigs. Instead, she stood by as a craze her film began barreled forward, without her or directors like her. After Twilight's success, Hardwicke notes, there were 4 more Twilights, 3 big-screen Divergents, 4 Hunger Games, and none of them were directed by women, she said, still incredulous. That was a heartbreak for me. There are other badass women out there that could have done those. Hardwicke is still fielding attention from producers who seek her out at events and tell her about the exciting female-led projects that they're working on. Often, though, when she asks if any female directors are on board, they'll balk. I've had producers say, we tried to have diversity. You tried, and you hired a white male again. So how hard did you try? She asked. That's the end of the quote. Part of what makes Catherine Hardwicke a complicated woman in my book is the fact that her status isn't simple. It isn't cut and dried. It's rather complex. She is simultaneously a hugely successful female film director, a director who didn't do the best in her portrayal of gender roles, and a woman behind the camera whose story reflects that of the women of the silent era, successful, having proven her worth time and again, most impressively with a tremendous box office smash on a low budget, and yet weirdly and inexplicably purged out of directing even the sequels to her own film as soon as it was understood that massive amounts of money and power were to be had from it. A film whose potential, we should point out, she recognized, whose script she dug out of the reject pile personally, and a film genre that it's fair to say she personally established. Complicated woman or not, the world owes a lot to Catherine Hardwicke, a woman behind the camera whose personal story illustrates how the soft purge is very much still going on. Leapfrogging off of Twilight onto a film that originated as a piece of kinky fan fiction involving the characters from that franchise, next up for better or for worse is 50 Shades of Grey from 2015. Despite being directed by a woman, Sam Taylor Johnson, and written by two women, Kelly Marcel and novelist E.L. James, 50 Shades of Grey is problematic for a whole slew of reasons, not the least of which is its highly irresponsible and infamously inaccurate depiction of the practices of the BDSM community, not only depicting but actually romanticizing a physically and emotionally abusive relationship, depicting yet another passive, extremely low agency female protagonist, and containing, perhaps most absurdly, far more female nudity and sexualization than male, despite this being a romance film with a predominantly female target audience. 50 Shades of Grey actually left a lot of my Blondes and Bombshells students scratching their heads last semester, as all of these issues really seem like things that should not have come from the work of a female director and two female writers. This is hard to explain, unless you can embrace an understanding of the existence of complicated women. There are women, again, who are sexist. There are women, again, who are wrong about things. I know it's easy to forget because of all of the great, progressive, unproblematic work created by women behind the camera that we've looked at all throughout this semester, but don't forget that just because a woman made the film, this does not mean that the film therefore cannot be sexist. Women can be sexist. It's counterintuitive, but it's true, so don't forget it. To illustrate and perhaps prove the very real validity of these ideas, let's take a look at 2015's 50 Shades of Grey right now.
So this is just an interview for the newspaper. I just have a couple of questions.
Mr. Grey will see you now.
What was he like? He was polite, intense, smart, really intimidating. Do you have any interests outside of work?
What about you? I'd like to know more about you.
There's really not much to know about me. Look at me.
I am.
To what do you owe your success?
I exercise control in all things, Miss Steele.
It must be really boring.
Got me looking so crazy right now. Your love's got me looking so crazy right now.
I'm incapable of leaving you alone.
Then don't.
I had a rough start in life. You should steer clear of me.
Got me hoping you save me right now. Your kiss.
I don't do romance.
Right now. Looking so crazy.
My tastes are very singular. You wouldn't understand.
Enlighten me then.
one student last semester point out that in 50 Shades of Grey, it is the male character who keeps his pants on during sex scenes, while the female character is shown basically completely naked, in spite of the fact that the male character is supposedly the more sexually liberated one of the two, and theoretically this is, you know, a movie where women are supposed to be the ones getting the most, you know, thrills out of it. And obviously that's assuming, you know, cis-het women, etc. Anyway, I keep turning this point over and over in my mind when it comes to this film, as it illustrates several key issues. Number one, the gender nudity bias. The gender nudity bias is basically a tendency in films since, you know, roughly the post-war era, to show more female nudity than male, clearly, as we have observed the result of who holds power in a patriarchal society with a patriarchal film industry, where male executives call the shots of who is and isn't okay to sexualize. And two, the fact that the gender nudity bias is literally built into currently existing MPAA guidelines, which will rate a film NC-17 for showing an erect male sexual organ, but which considers no part of a woman's body too sacred to show in an R-rated film. Interesting to note that in and of itself. And three, female directors can still fall into the trap of sexualizing women and not men, even in chick flicks, even when they know the majority of their audience is there to see the sexy guy for a wide variety of reasons. Maybe Sam Taylor Johnson just wasn't thinking, was on autopilot, and was so influenced by the historic tendency in films since the 1960s to sexualize women and not men that she fell right into doing just that by default. Maybe male studio heads felt uncomfortable with her showing male nudity and pressured her to show more of the woman naked and less of the man as a result of their own male gazes and priorities, perhaps arguing or even believing that this would somehow sell better. Maybe Sam Taylor Johnson is a British woman born in 1967 in a sexist place at a sexist time with a sexist upbringing that colored the default assumptions and thoughts that she grew up to have as an adult person and a film director. Any of these explanations are possible, perhaps all of them, perhaps some combination of the above. Overall, though, I think we can agree that this places director Sam Taylor Johnson, as well as writers Kelly Marcel and E.L. James, firmly in the category of complicated women. Finally, last but not least on our list of complicated women for tonight is Coraline Fargeat, the French writer-director of the 2017 film Revenge, which, trigger warning, is intended as a feministic take on the exploitative rape-revenge genre, but still falls into and contains some of the highly problematic tropes that this genre inherently entails. So again, I apologize, but I'm going to have to be talking about filmic depictions of rape for a little bit here. I won't be going too far into it or showing anything really visually explicit, don't worry, though I do know that the nature of this discussion is extremely difficult, and I want to be sensitive and aware of that, as statistically speaking, there are very likely sexual assault survivors within this very class. It is a disturbingly common experience in this country, and it affects both genders, despite what people in popular culture will have you believe. So if any of this content is too upsetting for anyone here, that's fine. I completely understand. No worries and no questions asked. Just email me and I will happily send you my notes for the rest of the video, as you will still be responsible for the material, which, like everything else, may be appearing in some form on the final exam. So for those of you who choose to opt out, you know, just email me. It will be fine. Otherwise, I will assume that you are sticking with me and watching what follows. Anyway, that said, let's take a deep breath. And, okay. Onward and forward, here we go. So unlike the depiction of rape as attempted by the vast majority of male directors who have tackled the subject, including Ridley Scott in Thelma and Louise, as we discussed in a previous lesson, Coraline Fargeat's depiction of the rape in Revenge is far more implicit and subtle, focused less on the usual explicit depictions of female nudity or sexualizing the victim's pain, as we far too often see with rape scenes directed by men, and centering more on the behavior of a disturbed bystander trying to get his mind off of what is going on in the next room, only cutting in with brief glimpses and sounds of the struggle. This is fairly consistent with what we might expect and what we historically tend to see in terms of the depiction of rape scenes with female victims when handled by female directors as opposed to men behind the camera. Perhaps this is obvious, but being female makes watching the sorts of female rape scenes commonly, and I think rather thoughtlessly, depicted in films and television extremely disturbing, and there is a point of, identification with the victim's gender that grates extremely hard, painfully, and offensively against the human self-concept. Interestingly, this sort of feeling about the depiction of rape where the victim shares one's own gender is also clearly the same for men, to the point at which there simply are no existing male equivalents, no depiction of male rape to point to within mainstream media culture for all of film history, really, that sexualize the male victims remotely to the degree that female victims are routinely sexualized in these types of scenes. This would point to the idea that male directors, who of course dominate the industry, only really seem comfortable directing rape scenes where the victims are female. Once the lens is turned onto a male victim, all of a sudden the depiction becomes much less sexualized for some reason when men are behind the camera. Why do you think that is? So I think an interesting and very reasonable parallel to this phenomenon is, of course, Coraline Faurier's rather similar depiction of the rape in her film Revenge, much more subtle, implied, and nowhere near as sexualized as most portrayals handled by male directors. Just in as much as when a man behind the camera is depicting a male rape, very similarly, I think, does Coraline Faurier's depiction, as a woman behind the camera depicting a female rape. Like these seem to be done similarly and for very much the same reasons. Additionally, Faurier's female protagonist survives not only the sexual assault, but also the attempted murder that follows it when the male company she is keeping decides to silence her permanently, after which, of course, the film becomes a revenge plot along the lines of what I had hoped to see in Kill Bill. To illustrate these points, let's take a look at 2017's Revenge right now.
Drive me completely crazy.
Stan Dimitri, my associates.
Hi.
Women always have to put up a fight.
While there are, of course, feministic aspects to this film, and perhaps these aspects even overpower the problematic nature of the genre, sure, that I think is up to the viewer, it's a matter of opinion, it nevertheless remains yet another film depicting a female rape victim, yet another film with a female protagonist whose main defining character backstory is that she got raped, and yet another film depicting a badass, strong woman whose badass strength is inherently tied to her status as a victim of sexual violence. This from a 2018 Glamour.com article entitled, "I'm tired of male screenwriters using rape as a convenient backstory for women." This is the quote. I don't really do films set in the modern day because the female characters nearly always get raped, Keira Knightley told Variety earlier this week. In the interview, the actress was asked if production companies are backing more female-dominated stories, to which she declared that it's slowly getting better. "I'm suddenly being sent scripts with present-day women who aren't raped in the first 5 pages and aren't simply there to be the loving girlfriend or wife." It's a somber day when one of Hollywood's leading movie stars has sworn off making new movies because rape is such a pervasive storyline in our cultural landscape. And that's the end of the quote. Obviously, in the case of Coraline Fargate, this is a woman writing the story and clearly intending to subvert a traditionally sexist genre with a feministic take on it. However, in doing so, in choosing to even participate in the rape revenge genre at all, Fargate nonetheless adds yet another entry to the long, long list of female characters whose main defining backstory is that they were raped, and hence her work, to my mind, easily falls into the category of complicated woman behind the camera. I want to pause here before we finish and just comment that, as I've said before in our Blondes and Bombshells class, part of the issue with the overcommon depiction of female characters as rape victims in film is the fact that we spend so little time with characters in a film. Like, films are rarely much longer than 2 hours long. And so if you have a character, who within that short time is depicted as a rape victim, and that becomes like their defining character trait, that really overshadows everything else about that person. In reality, such a huge disproportionate number of women, and actually a surprising number of men, are also, survivors of sexual violence and rape, that the reality is that, like, for those people, that's just one small, terrible thing that happened to them, but just not in any way the defining part of who they are as a person. A human being, if you were really to portray, a character study of a real person who, was perhaps a rape victim at one point, the fact that they were a rape victim might not even make it into your movie, because it is arguably, like, not necessarily, it may not even be on the list of important things about them. It may be the least important thing. Maybe it's something that doesn't enter into it. Maybe someone is a human being first and not defined by a terrible thing that happened to them once. And I think that when we have movies that disproportionately tell these stories about women specifically, where we have such a disproportionate number of female rape victims in film, that it actually rivals the real life number, which is insane. This is a problem. We have to stop telling this story. We have to stop sending this message to men and women, because the reason why the problem is so bad is in part the film industry's fault for depicting this as easy and common and normalizing it and sexualizing it. And so there's a whole big issue there. And if you want to know more about it, I recommend Blondes and Bombshells. Anyway, that's all for tonight, folks. The final part of your hidden assignment is to reply to your last email to me with any thoughts that you may have about any of the complicated women behind the camera that we have discussed here tonight, or any other thoughts that you may have. It could be anything about anyone, any questions, etc. I'm just curious about people's overall take on all of this stuff. This, like your hidden assignment, your first part of it, that is, will be due no later than 11:30 p.m. tonight. Good night, good luck, and keep those complex thoughts on complicated women